Dr. Cosette Lemelin, and it is a great pleasure to spend some time with you this afternoon. I've been looking forward to it. Thank you very much for joining us at the Teaching Institute this afternoon. If you haven't met me before, then I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I have been doing educational developer work for about 16 years now. Now, when I tell my friends and family that I am an educational developer, many of them have never heard that term before. And so most of the time I refer to myself as a teaching coach. I have many years of experience working in Western Canadian universities. I've been at the University of Alberta now, I'm into my 5th year, helping instructors with every aspect of teaching, in whether it is classroom management, assessment, course design, anything that could go right or wrong, be exciting, stressful about teaching and learning at a university. So I have been teaching online since 2011, and a lot has changed since then. A lot has changed just in the time that we have been in the pandemic situation. And so I want to thank you on behalf of your students and on behalf of your colleagues for investing this time in growing and rising to the challenge that we've been faced with recently with the pandemic and as we grow in our teaching at the University of Alberta. The last thing I'd like you to know about me that I think is relevant to this topic and also relevant as you get to know me is that my specialty within educational development is in helping instructors with teaching and learning interactions and building relationships with students in classrooms, in field or clinical placements, in teams and groups, and then most recently online. So that will be the focus of my talk today, in that how do we build our teaching presence, who we are as instructors online. Now, I am a very big fan of texts, and by that I don't mean text messages. I mean that I am a fan of books and printed paper, and when I mark my students' papers, I still print them out, which I realize is not very environmentally friendly, but I still love to write on paper. So this has been a stretch for me too. It has been a learning process for me too. And I want to say before we get started, that if someone like me, who is by nature someone who loves working with people and the complexities of human beings and teaching and learning interactions, can get online and learn to enjoy building interactions in this way, then I think you can too. So let's start our process together today. But there's so much that I have to tell you today that the challenge for me will be containing my ideas within the 45 minutes. So what I've chosen are what I think are the greatest hits or most important things about your teaching presence and the challenges of student to student or instructor-student interactions online. You'll notice at the beginning that I talked a little bit about myself. I'm the assistant director at CTL. I think of myself as a teaching coach, as an online instructor. One of the most impactful and meaningful ways that you can establish your teaching presence and who you are as an individual, as a scholar, as someone who is representing your field and maybe mentoring or bringing students into a field of study or professional practice, is to have a video introduction within your course. So it doesn't need to be long. It doesn't need to be super professional. We're not entertainers or actors. We are academics. And as you've seen today, often when we're working in Zoom, things are not perfect all the time. But a very short welcome video for the course, just to have a chance for your students to see you, to hear you. It sounds obvious, but many of us don't think about it. The students in your online course may not have the opportunity to physically meet you. And before COVID-19, when you met students in the classroom, that first day did a lot more than you might have realized. That first day gave the students an impression of you as a representative of your discipline, your course. In some of your disciplines, students are looking for role models of people or professionals that they might like to be in the future. And that first class created an impression of you and the course material and your connection to the course. So just like I did a moment ago, a short video that tells the students who you are, how you got into the business of this microbiology aspect or this area of nursing, how you see your role as an instructor in the course, depending on what type of course it is or the discipline it's in, or if it's a lab course, for example. And what are some of the initial fundamental expectations that you have for your students? So the research, because there are folks in education who have studied this, the research tells us that this first impression with your students is very important and that it does matter. Studies that were done comparing course evaluations when an instructor provided this type of introductory video in eClass, and when the instructor did not show the students in the course an introduction video, showed us that students who did have that introduction video and got to know the instructor and had a sort of a personalized introduction to the course, those students were more likely to participate in discussion boards, which was the focus of the research and many of the studies thus far. And most importantly for many of you, students who had that initial connection to the instructor were more likely to form a favorable impression of the instructor, the course, and provide more positive course evaluations. So interestingly enough, such a small thing can have a big impact. So today, as we gather together at the end of a busy teaching institute, I'm going to ask you if, to the extent that you are able in these very uncertain times, if you could minimize your distractions during our time together. So those of you who have a phone that is a distraction for you, if you would kindly put that phone on vibrate or out of your reach or out of sight. If you could close the tabs on your computer screen or maximize your Zoom screen, minimize the personal distractions to the extent that you are able, and I'll give you a moment to do that. Let's make the most of our time together in these 45 minutes so that we can have a really positive learning experience. Today, we're going to focus on a couple of key ideas around our teaching presence. I'm going to attempt to model these ideas within my own teaching presence and look at how three common concerns that occur in online teaching and learning, these interactions, are related to your teaching presence or could be impacted by your teaching presence. So let me talk a little further about teaching presence. What exactly do I mean by teaching presence, and why is it important to calibrate or think about your teaching presence when you are in teaching in an online course? Since 2011, I've learned a lot about what it meant to be an instructor online. I've made mistakes, I've learned from those mistakes, and I share advice in the hopes that you won't make those same mistakes. One of the first mistakes that I made was to spend a lot of time on the outset designing an online course and then putting lots of thought into how I wanted the students to connect with certain materials, what I wanted them to do in the course, setting up my eClass or whatever LMS I was using at the time. And then once the course started, I kind of treated it like a slow cooker. I kind of set it and forget it. It was a bit of a recipe for disaster, as you might imagine, because this slow cooker approach where I only checked in on my course every once in a while, once it was going, What happened with the slow cooker approach was that if I wasn't participating in the course, in the online course, if the students didn't know that I was there and didn't have a presence in the course, I'll give you more examples of what that meant in a moment, then they weren't motivated to participate either. So participating too little within the course and the students feeling like you're not there as a guide, as a facilitator, can be problematic. Now, the other extreme end of the situation is something that I experienced when I decided I was going to learn from the slow cooker example with a particular course, and I took the drone approach, meaning I was in my online course almost every day. I was checking my discussion boards, I was posting videos, I was making comments upon other students' comments upon my comments, and it was too much. It made my students crazy because they felt that they were being too heavily monitored, that I was hovering like a drone within the course, that they needed some time on their own to discuss and debate, maybe even make some mistakes if I had left them with a case or a problem to work on before I jumped in and gave comments or feedback or suggestions or another resource. I needed them to have a chance to work with the material for a while on their own or in their groups. So there is a sweet spot, and for each of you that will be slightly different in your teaching response, in your teaching presence, in you in an online course. There will be a sweet spot between being a slow cooker and a drone with your online course. You will figure this out over time, and one of the ways that you will learn to calibrate on this sort of spectrum of how much or how little you need to be in the course, how often, will be some of the problems that come up that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. So concern number one. This is a really common concern in online courses. Students are distracted, okay? Practically, in a very practical sense, the norms of our classrooms, now that they're online, have been removed. So the pressures of being everyone in the same room, all seated in either row seating or lecture seating or at tables or chairs or in a lab, and being surrounded by other students and the instructor are gone. So the student is left with a lot more responsibility for their own learning, which I think has been one of the themes that have been coming out in some of the presentations today. So some of the opportunities for students to be distracted by other things or by other concerns, particularly with everything that's happening in the world right now, are much higher. And I think as an instructor, we have to recognize that some level of distraction is going on, some background noise is going on, literally and metaphorically, figuratively, in a lot of our courses. So some of your students are going to be multitasking or distracted by other things while they're learning in your course. So now that we've taken a step away from my slides, I'd like you to add into the chat what you yourself, or if you have been working with students in online courses, or you may have some students at home of your own in your own life, what are the kinds of distractions that students are dealing with now? What is distracting them? Okay. So for example, one of the most common distractions is text messaging while an online class is happening. Okay. I might be teaching right now and students are texting and multitasking at the same time. So pop open the chat on the side and let's watch some of the things roll by And then I'll tell you in a moment what the research tells us. Let's just watch that for about 30 seconds. Oh, NHL hockey, yeah. That would be my husband. Smell of coffee, Neil. I have some food going in the slow cooker right now at my house. Attending class from bed, interesting. Nice weather outside. Okay, just another 10 seconds to add your thoughts. Playing video games, okay. So the research tells us that students are most commonly distracted by the very things that they need in order to learn online. So they're often distracted by texting, playing video games, watching television online, reading the news online, sports, browsing social media, or being on social networking sites, or any other sort of chatting with friends online. I think the research has not caught up with the COVID-19 reality of doing everything from home. And so many of the home things that you're mentioning, that's what I suspect is happening in the research. But one of the things that I find that we're really challenged by now is that students need computers and laptops and desktops and technology in order to participate in class. But the very tools that they are using are what they need to be in your class. So it's challenging. There is a whole body of research that I'd like to make you aware of. And the term that the body of research uses is cyber slacking. So if you go into the libraries and you're looking up examples of articles from that valuable presentation at lunch today, there is a body of research on cyber slacking and how students are using technology for non-class related activities as one of the major distractions in online learning. Okay. There's a couple things I want to say about that I think are important for you as instructors. I'd like you to know that your students are very often not aware of the extent to which their learning is impacted by this multitasking. There is a belief among many of our students, and I know this from my experience, I know this from talking to many of you, and I also know this from reading the literature. There is a belief among many of our students that they are able to effectively multitask or have their attention divided between multiple things at once without any serious consequences to their learning. And the research tells us a very different story. The research tells us that when students are multitasking or their attention is divided or they're distracted, these are the terms that are used within different debates on this topic. What the research tells us is that when students are distracted, multitasking, they have less understanding of the course material. We know that students' exam scores are lower when they are consistently distracted while learning. It doesn't seem to matter if they're learning on eClass and they're answering texts from students or whether they're learning in this environment, like a synchronous environment within Zoom. It seems to be predictive of lower exam scores. It's negatively predictive overall of students' GPA. So if you have very GPA-driven students who are concerned about their marks, this might be something that you talk about with your students and say, did you know that if you're really distracted in class and you're trying to do several things at once, that the research tells us that your GPA is likely to be lower? Generally, students who are distracted or multitasking during class have poor academic outcomes. And I think this is another important point that many students don't think of. It negatively impacts other students' learning within the course. And you as an instructor are responsible for the learning environment of all students. So if a student is distracted and they are distracted with other students within the class or other students in other courses, then it spreads, kind of like the Australian wildfires. So let me go back to my slides to talk about how teaching presence can help us along with a situation where students are now within teaching and learning likely to be more distracted. So we've talked about this. So the first thing I'd like to say about your teaching presence is I did something once we talked about the introductory video that I have found very useful in my own teaching and learning online. I have asked students to minimize the distractions to the extent that they are able. I was modeling there an approach that I found works for me in setting the expectation that students will be focused on the class for the time that we have together. Now, sometimes that is not possible for a 45-minute period, so I'll say to students, in the next 10 minutes of this video lecture or this task, if I'm in a synchronous class, I'll say, let's stay focused and try to manage our distractions, particularly within this period of time in class. On eClass, I found it very helpful to give students approximate time limits of how much time things will take and how much time they should commit to things. So if they are doing tasks in eClass, I've asked them to do a reading, I've asked them to follow through on an activity like those suggested in Ellen's session, the last session, then I might give them an approximate time limit, 20 to 30 minutes that they'll need in order to accomplish this task, to help them get a sense of how much time and energy and attention is needed for a task. I also know that students' attention spans get shorter and shorter as a class continues on. So I try to do breaks more frequently, even if it's just a 2-minute break, or if it's a multiple choice question that I put on the screen and I give students a minute to complete it. It breaks their distraction from just, oh, Cosette's talking, I'll just go and walk the dog, right? If they know a question is coming, then it brings the attention or the focus back, okay? I think, as I mentioned already, it's also important to talk to your students about the fact that, texting and driving and texting and learning are both have consequences, as an example. So another way that I help students focus their attention and help them manage their distractions or help them with multitasking, because it's very tempting, there's no question, is by using my teaching presence to curate my course. So when I'm in eClass, I will tell students why I've asked them to do a particular reading, or if I'm on a Zoom meeting or in a Zoom lecture, I might say why it's important to explore a particular topic or why a certain aspect of a particular topic is important. So I give them reasons why certain topics have more importance than others to help them focus. Students generally need some guidance and direction to know what are the most salient points within all the information we're giving them. So if you are posting, for instance, several readings to do within your eClass, making suggestions about the order at which the students do the reading. The students, when they look at your eClass, they're going to say, oh, I've got a 3-page reading or a 12-page reading. I'll just do the 3-page reading. But if you had put a line or two in your eClass saying, I'd like you to prioritize that 12-page reading, particularly these 2 sections, that helps them to focus in on some of the most important things in your course. So giving them some guidance about, is there a certain order they should be looking at things, reading things, Is there a certain deadline that they recommend them do certain readings or complete certain tasks by, as a way to help them pace their learning? So for example, in my eClass course, I might have a 2-minute video each week where I give students some advice about how to approach the course materials for the week. Hi team, it's week 3 in the course. You've noticed I've got 3 readings there in a video I want you to watch. It's really important you watch that video before we meet synchronously on Wednesday. Okay? I'd like you to watch the video and then have this particular document opened up in your browser when we go into our synchronous class. Okay? Just as an example. Some of the common challenges with this topic include, so you may find it helpful to do these questions within the readings or the textbook for the course, if you're still using a paper copy. So this is some way I help the students to know or help them estimate where they need to put their time and attention. Another way that teaching presence can help us with common concerns within teaching and learning situations online is with students who are lurking. I don't know if you've heard this term before. It has a very negative connotation. Thoughts about lurking have changed since 2005 when the term was introduced in the scholarly literature. Lurkers are the silent students in your course. These are the students who are observing, but they're not participating. Okay. Certainly, lurking, when the idea of lurking was first explored, it was viewed as something very negative in the sense that a lot of the writing about students lurking in courses was about how students were free riders who were benefiting from observing others and contributing little to the course as passive participants. Okay, even the word lurking, lurking goes with words like fear. It sounds like something from a scary movie. More recently, lurking has been re-examined within the literature, and what we've been learning about lurking in online courses and in online discussion environments is that lurking is fairly normal, and it's hard to completely eliminate lurking. It may be something that we learn to see as part of online participation. It is low-level, passive form of online participation. But students are lurking and watching others because often students lurk in a course. They don't contribute to the chat. They don't contribute to the discussion boards. They're there, but they're not participating because they either don't have the skills or they don't have the confidence to participate. So the students who are lurking within the course are often looking for models of how to participate in the course. They're looking for ways to get that confidence for, well, how can I find a way into participating myself? So for instance, they may be reading other students' discussion posts as a way to try and find an entry into the conversation, or to figure out, okay, who is the strong student that I can maybe model some of my comments after. So initially the thoughts on lurking were that it was something that was entirely problematic. What we see now is it's a stage where students are learning how to learn online, and they need more instruction in how to do that. If you find you have a lot of lurking in your course, this may occur in very large first, second year undergraduate courses, for example, where students are not familiar with the discipline, they're learning the language of the discipline, they're feeling lack of confidence because there are so many students in the course, it's important for you as an instructor and with your teaching, your presence as an instructor, to facilitate the activities, to moderate the discussions, to tell students that there will be questions coming up on these particular topics, to also check in with your students to find out what could we be doing in our course that would encourage you to participate more. Are there certain types of information, or are there certain skills, or are there certain opportunities within our course that would make you feel more comfortable participating? We had the Mentimeter survey asking, or maybe we'll just put it in the chat. Let's just put it in the chat. So the question that I had for you as participants this afternoon is, how can we check in with our students? How can we find out from them if we have lots of lurkers in our class? How could we check in with them to find out how they could participate more in their course? Now, some of you might have some tools you want to suggest, and some of you might have some strategies that you might want to suggest. I had an example poll, which we're not going to worry about now. Email. Okay, you might email some students and say, I'd love it if you'd participate more in the course. How can we make that happen? Some of you are saying an anonymous poll, a Mentimeter word cloud. Great ideas. Breakout rooms, fantastic, yes. Reflection questions, okay. Some of your students will like the chance to get the questions in advance of class and prepare their questions going into class. Some students are not great on their feet, so to speak, in class. Okay, ask students what worked well for them. Good. Check in with students, putting them into smaller groups, breakout rooms, smaller teams in the course. Great ideas. Many of the lurkers are going to feel much more comfortable participating in a smaller group than they are in the very large group. Today we are 164, and many of you might be feeling, I'm more comfortable putting my ideas in the chat than I am in putting up my hand and speaking into a camera. So the third concern that comes up in online courses, whether it's within eClass or whether within synchronous classes where we are having discussions or doing activities, is uncivil comments and behaviors. Okay, so what are uncivil behaviors online? If you were to explore incivility online, you will discover that there is a bit of debate within the academic literature about what constitutes uncivil and what is simply disruptive. The common themes or threads within this literature are that uncivil behaviors online are disruptive to the learning environment, to students' own learning, as well as the learning of other students. But the tone or the feeling about incivility online is that it's hostile, it's aggressive. Some other studies say that it can be intentional, while others will say it can be unintentional. So the extent to which it's disruptive is still something that's up for debate. I find this interesting as someone who's worked in this field for a long time, because if you have worked with me before in classroom management workshops, you'll know that I've talked about the fact that managing incivility in the classroom is a challenging topic for instructors, because each of us as instructors with a teaching persona or an online persona, each of us have different standards for what's acceptable in our classrooms or now in our online environments. Okay, so professionally, we have our own ideas about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable behaviors in our teaching and learning environments we're cultivating. And each of us has ideas or standards of things that push our buttons, quite frankly. I remember talking to an instructor a couple of years ago, and she had a student who was sitting in the front row of her large lecture class, and the student was knitting. And the student wasn't really being disruptive to her lecturing or her teaching, but she found this terribly uncivil that the student was knitting. So what might be disruptive for this instructor might not be disruptive for Graham, or might also be disruptive for me. So there is some personalization to what's disruptive and what's not disruptive. I think the next question that I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to be a bit brief on this one. We're just going to do a 30-second blast in the chat. If you can turn the chat on, Graham, is I think it's important for you to have a quick opportunity to say, what is incivility for you within an online course? What would you consider to be incivility? If you can put at least one idea in the chat in the next 30 seconds, we're going to watch that roll by for 1 minute, and then we'll talk about how your teaching persona can address it. And I'll popping bubbles with gum, sarcasm, inappropriate language. I had an instructor, just as you're reading those comments, I had an instructor tell me the other day that she wasn't sure if cameras on or off was uncivil. It can be quite relative to the purpose of your course, who you are as an instructor, what your expectations are of your students. Okay, so let's stop the chat. Within the research, the top things that are considered uncivil online are name calling, insults, rude comments, which many of you have already mentioned. Here's an interesting one. Failing to post or complete assignments in a timely manner was considered to be uncivil within some of the academic research. Things like posting very short, terse responses that don't add any meaning to the discussion. Ignoring other people's comments is something that's been raised within the literature as uncivil. Using inappropriate acronyms like WTF is considered by some instructors to be incivil. And posting personal information is considered to be by some. So this goes back to when you are in your class with your students, it's important for you to be clear about what your expectations are. I always recommend to instructors that they put those expectations in eClass and then they state them within video or state them in a couple of different ways. So you might have them in a video on eClass and then have them written into an introductory section of eClass, or you might state them just like I'm doing here in a Zoom meeting. If you involve your students in setting those expectations for online behavior, your students have had all kinds of different experiences with online behavior themselves. Okay, it might not be necessarily in an academic environment, but most students have had positive and negative experiences online. So if you asked them what's unacceptable and made them part of that conversation, you can come up with a list of behaviors that are not acceptable within your course. Now, maybe if it's a very, very large first-year class and the students are very inexperienced online, you as the instructor just want to set those expectations. But no matter whether you do decide to set it with your students or whether you set the expectations and make them clear for your students, there has to be some sort of process for when it occurs. Because chances are something's going to come up and it's either going to push your button or one student is going to say another student is pushing their button. So there needs to be some sort of process for how it's going to be handled. Do you want your students to talk to each other before they come to you? Do you want to have some examples of language from Jen Ward, for example, for those kinds of conversations? Do you want to have some examples of some online videos or some resources from some of our great services on campus about how conflict can be managed? And what kind of conflict could occur given the teaching and learning interactions in your course? I mean, group work is a very valuable experience, but you need to be able to manage some possible conflict within group work if it's going to be part of your course. So I know I'm coming to the end of my time, but your teaching and learning online presence is very important. The students need to know that you are there. Being there too much is a bit of a problem as well. So there is the sweet spot between the slow cooker and the drone. These are common concerns that come up in teaching and learning interactions, whether your course is entirely in eClass or is some combination of synchronous and asynchronous teaching and learning. And when it does come up, I want you to think about these things in advance of the fall so that you can be ready and that you are not caught off guard.